Jordan sat quietly at his desk, his eyes darting nervously to the clock on the wall. The lunch bell would ring soon, and with it, the familiar rush of excitement would fill the classroom as students eagerly filed out to the cafeteria. But Jordan wasn't feeling excited. In fact, his stomach was already twisting in knots, dreading the moment he would open his lunchbox and find nothing. It had been like this for weeks. Every single day, Jordan's lunch went missing. No one knew who was taking it, but it was always gone by the time he was ready to eat. The first few days, he thought he might have forgotten it at home. But after several times of checking and rechecking, he knew that wasn't the case. His lunch was disappearing right before his eyes. He tried to tell his mom, but she had been busy and just shrugged it off. "Maybe you just didn't put it in your bag, sweetie," she had suggested, her voice kind but distracted. Jordan didn't want to be a burden, so he let it go, until it happened again. And again. But today felt different. Today, he was going to find out who was taking his lunch. He couldn't stand it anymore. Jordan had never been the kind of kid to make waves. He was quiet, kept to himself, and stayed out of trouble. But today, he felt a strange sense of determination. As his classmates began to chatter and gather their things in preparation for lunch, Jordan stayed at his desk, pretending to tie his shoes, his heart racing. He had a plan. The cafeteria was bustling with the usual noise of children laughing, talking, and shuffling around as they found their seats. Jordan walked to the lunch line, keeping his head low. He saw his usual spot at the table where he always sat, next to his best friend, Marcus, but today, he wouldn't be sitting there. He was going to do something different. He grabbed his lunchbox and slipped quietly into the hallway, walking briskly towards the teacher's lounge. It was risky, but he couldn't take it anymore. Every day, his lunch vanished, and no one seemed to notice or care. He needed answers. Jordan had been observing for weeks now. He'd watched carefully, noticed patterns, and pieced together the little things that no one else seemed to pay attention to. Every day, his lunch went missing around the same time, right after the bell rang for lunch, but just before he had a chance to sit down and enjoy his meal. And that's when he noticed something even stranger. Thad Anderson, the strict and always put-together teacher who had been in charge of the lunchroom for the past year, would always disappear around the same time. Not once had anyone questioned where he went, but Jordan was beginning to have an idea. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jordan walked past the cafeteria doors and toward the teacher's lounge at the end of the hall. He reached the door, and for a moment, he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if he just had an overactive imagination? What if he was making a big mistake? But as the images of his empty lunchbox flashed in his mind, all doubt melted away. He couldn't ignore this anymore. Jordan pressed his ear to the door. He didn't hear anything at first, just the low murmur of conversation from the faculty room. He pushed the door open slightly, just enough to slip inside unnoticed. The room was empty except for one person, Thad Anderson, standing by the sink, eating something from a small plastic container. The faint sound of crunching echoed through the quiet room. Jordan's eyes widened. His stomach dropped. That was his lunch. The sandwich, the apple, the chips, he recognized it all. Thad Anderson was eating his lunch. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. He stood there, frozen, heart pounding in his chest. His first instinct was to run, to scream, to confront the teacher right there and then. But he couldn't. He wasn't sure what to do or how to even approach this strange and uncomfortable situation. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the evidence staring him in the face. It was undeniable. Thad Anderson, the very teacher who was supposed to protect him and all the other students, was the one taking his lunch. But why? Before he could even process what he was feeling, the door creaked open behind him. Jordan whipped around, startled. His best friend, Marcus, stood there, a puzzled expression on his face. "Yo, Jordan," Marcus said, his voice low. "What are you doing here? You're gonna miss lunch." Jordan quickly wiped his face, realizing that he had been staring at Thad Anderson for too long. He looked at Marcus, struggling to find the words. Nothing," Jordan muttered, his mind racing. "Just, nothing." Marcus frowned. "You okay, man?" Jordan nodded quickly, the weight of what he had just seen heavy on his shoulders. He had to get out of there. He didn't want Marcus to know. He didn't want anyone to know. But Jordan couldn't keep this to himself forever. The truth was too big to ignore. As he walked back to the cafeteria, the images of Thad Anderson eating his lunch kept replaying in his mind. His thoughts swirled. Why was the teacher doing this? And what could he do about it? As Jordan sat down at the table with Marcus, he couldn't help but feel a new kind of fear building inside him. This was no longer just about his missing lunch, it was about trust, about feeling safe. How could he trust a teacher who took from him every single day? The lunchroom was loud and chaotic as usual, but Jordan couldn't focus on any of it. His mind was elsewhere, wrestling with the truth he had uncovered. He had to tell someone. He had to do something. But as he looked around at his friends, his classmates, and his teachers, one thought kept repeating in his mind: who would believe him? The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, but Jordan didn't feel like he'd eaten at all. He had something much bigger to figure out. With a final glance at Thad Anderson, who was still sitting at his desk, oblivious to Jordan's discovery, Jordan made a silent promise to himself. He would find a way to make this right. And no one, not even a teacher, was going to steal his lunch again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jordan sat quietly at his desk, the weight of what he had just uncovered pressing down on him. The discovery that Thad Anderson, his teacher, had been taking his lunch every day was too much to comprehend. His mind raced, but it didn't seem to make sense. Teachers were supposed to be the ones who looked out for students, not take from them. Jordan wasn't an overly emotional kid, but today, he felt something he couldn't shake: betrayal. He had always admired Mr. Anderson. The teacher was strict but fair, or so Jordan had thought. He wasn't the kind of kid who liked to make waves, to stand out. He was the quiet type, the one who blended in with the crowd, staying out of trouble. But this wasn't about trouble, this was about something deeper. Jordan's mind drifted back to his family. They didn't have much. His mom worked long hours as a nurse, and his dad, though he tried his best, had been out of work for months after a bad injury that kept him from his construction job. It wasn't easy. They got by, but there were sacrifices. Jordan had learned early that nothing came easy, and when you had little, you cherished what you had, especially the small things. Things like lunch. Jordan had always liked his school lunches. His mom made sure to pack him a variety: a peanut butter sandwich with some honey on whole grain bread, a few chips, an apple, and his favorite, small packets of raisins. She'd even included a little note once in a while, just to remind him that she loved him. He'd never told anyone about those notes, they were his little secret, something to make him feel loved even when his mom couldn't be there. But now, all of that felt like it was being taken away. That afternoon, after lunch, Jordan was quiet, lost in thought. He couldn't focus on the lesson. The words coming from Mr. Anderson's mouth sounded like a distant hum as he stared out the window. What was he supposed to do with the truth he had just learned? His best friend Marcus noticed Jordan's distant demeanor. "Yo, what's up, man? You're awfully quiet today," Marcus said, nudging him. Jordan glanced over at him. Marcus was always upbeat, always the one to make people laugh. He was the complete opposite of Jordan in many ways: outgoing, confident, and never afraid to speak his mind. But Jordan wasn't sure how to talk about what had just happened. I don't know, man," Jordan said quietly. Something's not right. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Like what? Jordan hesitated for a moment, but then he thought, why not? Marcus was his best friend. He could trust him. Besides, Jordan knew that keeping this a secret wasn't going to make things go away. Mr. Anderson, Jordan began, his voice shaky. He's been taking my lunch every day. Marcus blinked in surprise. What? No way. I'm serious, Jordan said, his voice a bit stronger. I saw him today. He was eating my lunch in the teacher's lounge. It was the same lunch I packed, same sandwich, same apple. Marcus looked around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. Man, that's messed up, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You sure about this? Maybe you saw wrong. Jordan shook his head. No, I saw it with my own eyes. I'm sure. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, clearly unsure of what to say. Then, he nodded. Well, what are you going to do about it? That question hit Jordan hard. He hadn't even thought that far ahead. What could he do? No one would believe him. Who would believe that a teacher, a grown adult, was stealing a kid's lunch every day? It was ridiculous. But it didn't change the fact that it was happening. I don't know yet, Jordan muttered. But I can't just let it go. It's not right. Well, whatever you do, man, you've got to be careful, Marcus warned. Teachers don't mess around. They could make things worse for you. Jordan nodded. He knew Marcus was right. Teachers were powerful in the school, and if he made the wrong move, it could blow back on him. He'd have to be smart about this. But just the thought of Mr. Anderson sitting there, enjoying the lunch his mom had carefully packed for him, filled him with a quiet, seething anger. Jordan knew he couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about food, it was about respect, trust, and standing up for what was right. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Jordan packed his bag quickly. He couldn't wait to get home. He needed to talk to his parents, especially his dad. His mom was always busy, but his dad would know what to do. His dad was strong, tough, and always stood up for what was right. If anyone could help him figure this out, it was his dad. Jordan walked out of the school with Marcus, his mind racing with questions and ideas. As they walked down the sidewalk, Jordan felt a strange mix of determination and fear. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let Mr. Anderson get away with this. Later that evening, as Jordan sat down at the dinner table, he barely touched his food. His mom gave him a curious look but didn't say anything. His dad, however, noticed right away. Everything okay, son? He asked, his voice low but full of concern. Jordan hesitated, unsure of how to start. His dad could be intense when it came to standing up for himself. He didn't want to worry his parents, but this wasn't something he could ignore. Dad, I need to tell you something, Jordan said quietly, his voice trembling a little. It's about Mr. Anderson. He's been taking my lunch every day. His dad's face hardened at the mention of the teacher's name. What do you mean, son? Jordan took a deep breath. I saw him today. In the teacher's lounge. He was eating my lunch. Same sandwich, same apple. I think he's been doing it for weeks. His dad's expression shifted from confusion to anger. That's not right, Jordan. No one takes what's yours, especially not a grown man. We're going to figure this out. Jordan nodded, feeling a little bit of relief at his dad's words. For the first time since the whole thing had started, he felt like someone had his back. His dad would know what to do. They were going to make this right. His dad stood up from the table, looking at Jordan with a fierce expression. We're going to take care of this. No one messes with my son. And for the first time in a long time, Jordan felt the spark of hope. Maybe this wasn't over after all. The next morning, Jordan woke up to the familiar sound of his alarm ringing in his ears. He groggily reached over and hit the snooze button, wishing he could just stay in bed and forget about everything. But that wasn't an option. His stomach churned as he remembered what he had discovered yesterday. Mr. Anderson, his teacher, had been stealing his lunch, every single day. Jordan rubbed his face, trying to shake the lingering thoughts. His dad had promised they would figure it out, and Jordan trusted him. But even with his dad's promise, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What if things went wrong? What if Mr. Anderson tried to cover it up or deny everything? What if no one believed him? As he got ready for school, Jordan noticed his mom was already gone, off to work for another long shift at the hospital. She worked hard, and he admired her for it, but it also meant she wasn't around when he needed to talk to her about things like this. His dad, on the other hand, was always there when it mattered most. When Jordan entered the kitchen, his dad was already sitting at the table, drinking his morning coffee. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, and work boots. Jordan's dad had always been a man of action, not words. He didn't waste time talking about problems, he just fixed them. "Good morning, son," his dad said, looking up from his mug. "You ready for today?" Jordan nodded, still feeling a little uncertain, but he appreciated the steady confidence in his dad's voice. He took a seat at the table, his mind already focused on what came next. "I'm ready, but I don't know what to do next. What if we go to the principal, and Mr. Anderson denies it? What if no one believes me?" Jordan asked, his voice tinged with worry. His dad's expression softened, and he leaned forward. "You've got a lot of good instincts, Jordan. That's what's going to help us. We can't just go in there without evidence. That's why we need a plan." Jordan looked up at his dad, the gears in his mind turning. "A plan?" "Yeah," his dad said, nodding. "We're going to catch him in the act." Jordan blinked, unsure of what his dad meant. "You mean I should try to catch him taking my lunch again?" His dad smiled a little. "Exactly. But this time, we'll make sure we have proof. We'll set up a way to catch him red-handed." Jordan felt a sense of relief wash over him. He liked the idea of having some solid proof to back up his story. It felt more concrete. More like something that could be taken seriously. "How are we going to do that?" Jordan asked. "Leave that to me," his dad said, his voice calm but with that familiar spark of determination. "We'll need to set up a camera, something small, something that doesn't get noticed. I know a guy who can help with that. But we have to be careful. If we're going to pull this off, we can't let Mr. Anderson know what we're up to." Jordan's eyes widened in surprise. "You know someone who can help with that? A camera?" His dad chuckled softly. "You'd be surprised what I know. Just trust me on this." For the rest of the morning, Jordan's thoughts were consumed with the plan. The idea of catching Mr. Anderson in the act seemed almost too simple, but at the same time, it felt like the only way to make sure his story would be believed. He didn't want to confront Mr. Anderson without concrete evidence, it would be too risky. He didn't want to end up looking crazy or paranoid. By the time they arrived at school, Jordan felt a little bit better. His dad had already set the wheels in motion to get a camera, and Jordan had a sense of purpose. He wasn't just going to let Mr. Anderson get away with this. He was going to get the proof he needed, and he was going to stand up for himself. As Jordan walked through the school gates, he saw his best friend Marcus waiting by the entrance. Marcus grinned when he saw Jordan. "Yo, man. What's up? You okay today?" Marcus asked, his voice light and carefree. Jordan gave a small smile, trying to act like everything was fine. "Yeah, I'm good. Just ready to get through the day." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You've been kind of quiet lately." Jordan hesitated for a second before speaking. Yeah, I've been thinking. I think I'm going to do something about it. Marcus looked confused. Do something about what? You know, about Mr. Anderson. About my lunch, Jordan said quietly. I'm going to prove that he's been taking it. Marcus's eyes widened. No way. You really think you can catch him? Jordan nodded. Yeah. I've got a plan. And I'm not going to let him get away with it anymore. Marcus thought about it for a moment before grinning. Well, if you need help with anything, let me know. I've got your back. Jordan felt a surge of gratitude for Marcus. He hadn't even told him the whole plan yet, but his friend was already offering to help. That was the kind of support he needed. As the school day went on, Jordan's thoughts were fixed on the plan. He was anxious, but there was a spark of excitement too. He was taking control of the situation. He was going to catch Mr. Anderson in the act, and nothing was going to stop him. The bell rang at the end of the day, signaling the start of lunch. Jordan walked into the cafeteria, scanning the room for any signs of Mr. Anderson. He sat down at his usual table, his heart pounding in his chest. Today, he was going to put his plan into action. The camera was ready, and everything was set. All he had to do now was wait for the right moment. As the students around him chattered and ate, Jordan kept his eyes on the door. He couldn't let Mr. Anderson out of his sight. Not now. Finally, the moment arrived. Mr. Anderson walked into the cafeteria, his eyes scanning the room. Jordan felt his pulse quicken. This was it. With a steady breath, he slipped his hand into his bag and activated the small camera hidden inside. He knew it was time. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. The minutes felt like hours as Jordan sat at his lunch table, pretending to eat but really just watching, waiting. Every time someone walked by, his heart jumped in his chest, but it wasn't the normal cafeteria bustle that had his attention, it was Mr. Anderson. The teacher walked into the cafeteria, scanning the room as usual. Jordan's eyes followed him, trying to look casual as he fiddled with the corner of his sandwich, pretending to chew while his mind raced. This was the moment. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The small camera hidden in his bag was his best chance at proving he wasn't crazy. He wasn't imagining things. As Mr. Anderson walked toward the teacher's table, he made a slight detour toward the area where Jordan's lunch sat on the counter. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. He was doing it again. He was about to take Jordan's lunch, again. The camera was running now, the small lens discreetly peeking from under the flap of Jordan's bag. It was set to record the entire scene, to capture the proof he needed. Jordan's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, trying not to make any noise, trying not to draw attention to himself. He kept his gaze fixed on Mr. Anderson, watching as the teacher casually picked up the apple from his lunch tray and began nibbling on it. Jordan could feel a hot rush of anger rising in him, his face flushing as the teacher took another bite of his apple, the apple his mom had packed for him that morning. Hey, Mr. Anderson, a voice broke Jordan's focus, pulling his attention momentarily. It was another teacher, one of the PE coaches, coming over to speak to Mr. Anderson. Jordan snapped out of his anger trance, watching the teacher carefully set down the apple and turn to chat with the coach. The brief interruption was enough to pull Mr. Anderson's attention away from the lunch, but Jordan's heart was still racing. He had just witnessed it. He had seen it with his own eyes, and he now had the camera to prove it. The bell rang just a few minutes later, signaling the end of lunch, and Jordan gathered his things quickly. His hands shook slightly as he packed away his lunch and the bag with the hidden camera. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, trying to process everything he had just seen. But one thing was clear, he had the evidence now. He was no longer imagining things. Mr. Anderson had been taking his lunch, just like he thought. The rest of the day went by in a blur. Jordan couldn't focus. He couldn't sit still. All he could think about was the camera footage and what to do next. His dad had warned him to be careful, to make sure they had everything in order before confronting Mr. Anderson. But now, Jordan didn't want to wait any longer. He couldn't. The feeling of injustice was eating away at him. He wasn't just going to let this go. When the school day ended, Jordan felt a mix of nervous energy and determination. He had been dreading going home alone, but he knew he had to talk to his dad. There was no more time to waste. Jordan caught up with Marcus outside the school gate, who was waiting for him, as usual. Marcus smiled at him, but Jordan couldn't quite return the smile. His friend could tell something was off. "Yo, man. What's up? You look like you're about to burst," Marcus said, raising an eyebrow. Jordan glanced around, making sure no one else was close enough to hear. "I got it," he said, his voice low. Marcus furrowed his brow, confused. "Got what?" "The proof," Jordan said, a sense of urgency in his voice. "I saw him, Mr. Anderson. He took my lunch. I recorded it." Marcus's mouth dropped open. "No way. You got him on tape?" Jordan nodded. "Yeah. It's all there. The camera caught him eating my apple." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's wild. So, what are you gonna do with it? Are you gonna show the principal?" Jordan paused, the weight of his next decision sinking in. "I don't know yet. I need to talk to my dad first." "Well, whatever you do, man, you've got this. Don't let him get away with it. You've got the proof now. You can't just back down," Marcus said, a serious edge to his voice. Jordan nodded. "I'm not backing down. I just need to make sure I do this the right way." The walk home felt longer than usual, with Jordan's mind racing with 1,000 different possibilities of what might happen next. By the time he reached his house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. His dad's truck was parked out front, so at least he knew he wasn't going to be alone. He pushed open the door, calling out, "Dad?" "I'm in here, son," his dad's voice came from the living room. Jordan walked into the room, his heart beating faster now. He pulled the small camera out of his bag and handed it to his dad. "I got it," Jordan said, his voice a little shaky. "I recorded him." His dad looked at the camera for a long moment, his face hard to read. Then he nodded slowly. "Good. Let's see what we've got." Jordan watched as his dad plugged the camera into the TV and began playing the footage. The screen showed the familiar scene of the cafeteria, the hustle and bustle of students. Then came the moment, the camera zoomed in on Mr. Anderson as he casually walked over to Jordan's lunch and picked up the apple. He bit into it, completely unaware that he was being watched. Jordan's dad stayed silent as the footage played. Jordan couldn't bring himself to watch his dad's face, too afraid of what his reaction might be. Would he be angry? Disappointed? Jordan wasn't sure if he was ready to see it. When the footage ended, his dad finally spoke. "Well, there's no denying that. He took your lunch, all right." Jordan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "So what do we do now?" His dad looked at him with a firm, steady gaze. "Now we go to the school. We show this to the principal. We don't just go in there and demand answers. We go in with the truth. We show him this video, and we make sure he knows what happened. No one gets to treat you like that, Jordan. No one." Jordan felt his stomach flip at the thought of confronting the principal. It wasn't going to be easy. But he knew his dad was right. The truth was on his side. "I'm ready," Jordan said, the determination in his voice stronger than ever. His dad nodded and stood up, giving him a small smile. "Good. We'll handle this together." The next morning, Jordan woke up feeling a mix of dread and determination. Today was the day. Today, he and his dad were going to confront the school, to show the principal what Mr. Anderson had been doing. The truth was on their side, and Jordan knew they had to stand their ground. But that didn't mean it was going to be easy. Jordan couldn't focus on anything else during breakfast. His dad, noticing his son's unease, took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down with a firm click. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice steady but full of concern. Jordan nodded, though he could tell his dad wasn't fully convinced. "Yeah. Just nervous. What if the principal doesn't believe us? What if they don't do anything about it?" His dad leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Look, Jordan. It's natural to feel that way. But we've got the evidence. That's all that matters. This isn't about believing or not believing, it's about what's right. And we're going to make sure they see that." Jordan took a deep breath and tried to calm the butterflies in his stomach. His dad was right. He had the proof now. He wasn't imagining things. The video showed exactly what Mr. Anderson had been doing to him. The only thing left to do now was take it to the school and make sure Mr. Anderson couldn't get away with it. They drove to the school in silence, the tension between them palpable. Jordan could see his dad's knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in concentration. They both knew this wasn't going to be easy, but they also knew it had to be done. When they arrived at the school, Jordan's heart rate quickened. He felt like he was walking into a battlefield. The front doors of the school loomed ahead, and the thought of going inside, into the principal's office, made him feel small. "Ready?" his dad asked, his voice low and reassuring. Jordan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Yeah." His dad gave him a brief nod and led the way inside. The school was as bustling as usual, students laughing and chatting as they walked between classes, but today it felt different. Today, Jordan wasn't just another student. Today, he was about to expose the truth. They made their way to the principal's office. The secretary, a woman with a warm smile, greeted them as they entered. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" "We need to speak to Principal Harris," Jordan's dad said, his voice firm but polite. The secretary raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Is this about something serious?" "Yes," Jordan's dad replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The secretary stood up and made her way to the principal's office, knocking lightly on the door before entering. After a moment, she emerged. "Principal Harris will see you now." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. They were about to confront everything. He followed his dad into the principal's office, where Principal Harris was sitting behind his desk, flipping through some papers. He looked up when they entered, his gaze lingering for a moment before he offered a courteous smile. "Good morning. What can I do for you today?" Jordan's dad wasted no time. "We need to talk about something that's been happening to my son. Something that's unacceptable." Principal Harris looked up at them, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "I'm listening." Jordan's dad sat down in one of the chairs, and Jordan stood beside him, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on him. He could feel his hands shaking, but he clenched them into fists, forcing himself to stay calm. This was his chance to make sure Mr. Anderson couldn't get away with what he'd been doing. "We have evidence that a teacher here has been stealing my son's lunch every day," Jordan's dad said, his voice unwavering. Principal Harris blinked, clearly taken aback. "Stealing lunch? That's a very serious accusation." "I know it is," Jordan's dad said, his voice low but insistent. "And we wouldn't be here if we didn't have proof." Jordan felt his stomach tighten as his dad pulled out the small camera and plugged it into the TV in the corner of the office. The screen flickered to life, and Jordan's heart raced as the footage of Mr. Anderson taking his lunch played out in front of Principal Harris. The video clearly showed Mr. Anderson walking over to Jordan's lunch, picking up the apple, and taking a bite. The principal watched in stunned silence as the video played, his face unreadable. When the footage ended, Principal Harris leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room, and Jordan's mind raced. What was the principal going to do? Would he take this seriously? I don't know what to say, Principal Harris finally muttered. This is highly unusual, to say the least. Jordan's dad didn't miss a beat. This is happening in your school. You're responsible for making sure your teachers act appropriately. This is a clear violation of trust and ethics. What are you going to do about it? Principal Harris's face reddened, but he quickly regained his composure. I will, of course, investigate this matter thoroughly. I'll need to speak to Mr. Anderson and review his side of the story before taking any action. Jordan's dad nodded. We understand that. But make no mistake, this is a serious issue. My son's well-being is at stake here, and I won't stand by while someone abuses their position of power. The principal nodded slowly, looking at the screen again. I understand. I will address this immediately. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as he exchanged a glance with his dad. They had done it. They had exposed Mr. Anderson. Jordan could already feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. Principal Harris leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. I will handle this. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. And I assure you, we will take swift action. Jordan's dad stood up and nodded. Good. We'll be following up on this. I trust you'll handle it with the seriousness it deserves. As they left the office, Jordan felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. He had done it. He had stood up for himself, and now the school was going to take action. But as they walked back to the car, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There was no telling how far Mr. Anderson would go to cover his tracks or how the school would handle the situation. But for now, at least, Jordan knew one thing for sure, he wasn't alone in this anymore. His dad was with him every step of the way, and together, they would make sure that the truth came out. The days following the confrontation felt like an endless blur for Jordan. He went to school every day, but his heart wasn't in it. The weight of what had happened, what was still happening, pressed on him with every step. It wasn't just the classroom that felt different, it was the air around him, thick with a tension he couldn't shake. He couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation in Principal Harris's office. The video. Mr. Anderson's face. The way his heart had raced as he stood there, waiting for the principal to do something. But now that the truth had been exposed, the fallout loomed large. What would happen to Mr. Anderson? Would he be fired? Or would this just fade into the background like so many other school scandals? The hardest part, Jordan found, wasn't just the waiting. It was the fact that nothing seemed to have changed right away. Mr. Anderson was still a teacher at the school. He still showed up every morning, and Jordan had to see him in the hallways, had to sit through his lessons with that sinking feeling in his stomach. It was hard to concentrate in class, especially when he saw the lunch table where he used to sit, where he used to feel safe. Now, every time he looked at the seat across from him, where Mr. Anderson would sit, he saw a reminder of what had happened. During lunch, Jordan sat with his friends, Marcus among them. Marcus was quick to offer his support. Man, that teacher is messed up, Marcus said one day as they dug into their lunches. What kind of grown adult steals a kid's lunch like that? Dude is straight up a thief. Jordan couldn't help but smile a little. It felt good to have Marcus on his side, but the smile was short-lived. I don't know, Marcus, he said quietly. It's just, all this waiting. What if nothing changes? What if he just gets away with it? Marcus shook his head. Nah, man, you did the right thing. He can't get away with it now. You've already got the proof, you've already shown what kind of person he is. There's no way he's gonna just walk away from this. Jordan wasn't so sure. He had seen enough of how things worked in school to know that the truth didn't always win. People could be stubborn, especially when their own interests were at stake. He had no idea what would happen to Mr. Anderson now that his actions were out in the open. Would the principal really do something about it? Days stretched on, and Jordan's worry continued to grow. The sense of relief he had briefly felt after the confrontation in Principal Harris's office was fading, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. He couldn't focus. He couldn't concentrate. Every time he walked through the halls, he saw the stares of other students, some sympathetic, some curious, and some just indifferent. It wasn't until Friday afternoon that Jordan's dad finally called him. His voice was calm, but there was a sense of urgency behind it. "Jordan," his dad said, "I need you to come home right away. We need to talk." Jordan's stomach twisted. His heart skipped a beat. "Dad, what happened? Is everything okay? Just come home, son. We'll talk when you get here." Jordan felt his hands go cold as he grabbed his bag and rushed out of school. His thoughts were running wild. Was this about Mr. Anderson? Had something happened in the investigation? His mind was racing, but all he could think about was getting home. When he walked through the front door, his dad was sitting in the living room, waiting. His expression was serious, even grim. Jordan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Dad, what's going on?" Jordan asked as he dropped his bag by the door. "Sit down," his dad said, his voice steady but firm. Jordan's legs felt heavy as he sat down next to his dad on the couch. His heart was pounding in his chest. Whatever was about to happen, he wasn't prepared for it. "I just got off the phone with Principal Harris," his dad began. He looked at Jordan, his face calm but his eyes intense. "After reviewing the evidence, and after talking to a few people, they've decided to suspend Mr. Anderson while they conduct a full investigation." Jordan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Suspended. That was something, at least. But was it enough? Would they take it far enough to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else? "What does that mean, exactly?" Jordan asked. His voice was tight with anxiety. "Is he going to be fired?" His dad sighed deeply. "The investigation is ongoing. They'll determine if firing him is necessary. But for now, he's suspended, and they're taking this seriously. They said they're doing everything they can to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Jordan's stomach twisted in frustration. He wanted to feel relief, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. Suspended? That was the bare minimum. What would stop Mr. Anderson from getting a second chance? What would stop him from doing something like this again? "It's not enough, Dad," Jordan said, his voice shaking slightly. "He took my lunch every day. He took food from me. He took something that wasn't his. How is that okay? How is that something we can just let slide?" His dad's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "I understand, son. Believe me, I understand. But this is how it works. They have to follow procedures, they have to make sure everything is handled properly. We can't just rush to judgment. It's frustrating, I know. But we've done our part. The truth is out, and it's up to them to take action." Jordan stared at his dad, the words sinking in, but the frustration still simmering inside him. He wanted more. He wanted justice, real justice, not just suspension. But he knew there wasn't much more they could do at this point. They had gone to the principal, shown the proof, and now they had to trust that the school would follow through. After a long silence, Jordan's dad finally spoke again. "I'm proud of you, Jordan. You did the right thing. You stood up for yourself, and you made sure people saw the truth. That's not easy. It's not easy to stand up to someone with power, especially when you don't know what's going to happen." Jordan nodded, though he didn't feel proud. He felt empty. He wanted to feel like this had been worth it, like the school was going to make things right. But for now, it was just a waiting game. A waiting game he didn't know how to play. The following days passed, and the suspension remained the only real action. There were no immediate consequences for Mr. Anderson. The school said they would continue their investigation, but Jordan knew that it might take weeks, maybe longer. Would he even be able to return to that school knowing Mr. Anderson might come back as if nothing had happened? In the silence that followed, Jordan realized something that shifted something deep inside him. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that principal's office. He had spoken up, he had taken a stand, and no matter what happened next, he had forced people to listen. That was enough, for now. Jordan couldn't stop thinking about the last few days. After the suspension, there had been no immediate resolution, and it left a sense of uncertainty hanging over him. He went to school each day, but it didn't feel the same. There was an undercurrent of unease in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. The fact that Mr. Anderson was still in the picture, suspended, but not fired, gnawed at Jordan. His dad had assured him the investigation would take time, but Jordan couldn't help but feel like the school was dragging its feet. His mind kept racing. What if Mr. Anderson came back and nothing had really changed? What if the school swept it under the rug? And what about him? Would people still look at him the same way? He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to be the center of attention or the one to expose Mr. Anderson. But it was happening, and it wasn't easy. Jordan felt the eyes on him at school, the sympathetic ones, the curious ones, the ones that made him wonder if they were all just waiting for him to crack. That Friday, Jordan walked into school with the same weight on his shoulders. The hallways felt more crowded than usual. As he made his way to his locker, a couple of older kids passed by, whispering, though Jordan couldn't make out what they were saying. He just kept his head down, focusing on getting to class. It was like walking through a fog. By lunchtime, things hadn't gotten any better. He sat with Marcus, but his mind wasn't really there. The cafeteria, usually bustling with energy, felt like it had an ominous undercurrent. Some of the kids were talking about Mr. Anderson's suspension, speculating on what might happen next. Others had stopped talking altogether, pretending like they didn't know anything was wrong. Marcus noticed that Jordan was quieter than usual. "Yo, what's up with you today?" he asked. "You good?" Jordan looked at his friend, then back down at his tray. "I don't know, Marcus. It just feels like everyone's talking about it. They're all looking at me like I'm some kind of hero, but I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." "I get it, man," Marcus said, nodding. "But you did something important. You stood up when no one else would. That's bigger than you realize." "I don't know about that," Jordan muttered, still feeling that unease deep in his chest. "I just want it to be over. I want to be able to go back to just being me." But it didn't feel like he could go back to being just him anymore. Even if the school tried to move on, things had changed. And even if Mr. Anderson was suspended, the damage had already been done. The lunch theft, the betrayal of trust, it wasn't just about food anymore. It was about the system, the way it had allowed someone like Mr. Anderson to get away with something like that for so long. It was about how people had turned a blind eye until someone forced them to see the truth. Later that afternoon, Jordan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his dad. "Jordan, I need you to come home after school. I have something important to discuss with you." Jordan felt his stomach flip. His dad never sent texts like that. The last time he had, it had been the call about the meeting with Principal Harris. Something big was happening. The rest of the day dragged. He tried his best to focus on the lessons, but his mind kept racing. What did his dad want to talk about? Was there news about Mr. Anderson? Had something happened with the investigation? When the final bell rang, Jordan grabbed his stuff and practically ran home. He couldn't get there fast enough. As soon as he walked through the door, he saw his dad sitting at the kitchen table, a serious look on his face. Jordan's heart sank. This wasn't going to be good news. "Sit down, son," his dad said. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness in it that made Jordan's stomach turn. "Dad, what's going on?" Jordan asked, taking a seat across from him. "I just got off the phone with Principal Harris again," his dad began. Jordan leaned forward, waiting for the next words to come. "They've made their decision." Jordan held his breath. "What's the decision? What happens next?" His dad's gaze softened. "They've decided to reinstate Mr. Anderson. They say there wasn't enough evidence to support firing him, and while they acknowledge the suspension was necessary, they're going to allow him to return to the classroom once the investigation is complete." Jordan felt like the room was spinning. Reinstated? After everything? After all the proof? After everything he had done to bring the truth to light? Wait, what? Jordan shot to his feet, his hands trembling. How can they do that? There's video. There's actual proof that he stole from me. How can they just let him come back like nothing happened? His dad stood up, too, his expression torn. "I know it's frustrating, Jordan. Believe me, I'm angry, too. But they're following their policies. The school said they couldn't act without further evidence. They're not saying he did nothing wrong, they're just not ready to make that call yet." Jordan felt a lump form in his throat. His dad was right. There wasn't anything else they could do for now. They had given the school everything they could. They had exposed the truth. But it wasn't enough to get Mr. Anderson fired. "I don't understand," Jordan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "How is that fair? How can he just come back like nothing happened? Doesn't anyone care about what he did?" His dad sighed and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We've done everything we can, Jordan. Sometimes the system doesn't work the way we want it to. But that doesn't mean we give up. It just means we keep fighting, even when it feels like it's not enough." Jordan's mind raced. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw something. But instead, all he could do was sit there, feeling the weight of the world press down on him. This wasn't over. It wasn't by a long shot. But the fight was far from over, too. The weight of his father's words settled heavily on Jordan's chest as the days dragged on. The news that Mr. Anderson was being reinstated shattered something inside him. He had been sure that the truth would bring about justice, that the video evidence and his testimony would be enough to hold Mr. Anderson accountable. But now, it seemed like nothing had changed. The teacher who had humiliated him day after day, who had stolen his lunch, was coming back to the school. It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. Jordan spent the next few days wrestling with his emotions. He went to school, but it felt different now. The hallways were no longer just a place where he walked, they were a reminder of everything that had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Anderson's return. The idea that the man who had taken so much from him could simply return to class, as if nothing had happened, made his stomach churn. It wasn't just about the lunch anymore. It was about his dignity, his sense of justice, and the system that seemed willing to let someone get away with something so wrong. "Man, I don't get it," Marcus said one day, as they sat together at lunch. Jordan hadn't really been eating much, but Marcus didn't seem to mind. He always knew when something was bothering Jordan. How are they gonna let that dude come back after everything? It doesn't make sense. What if he does it again? Jordan shook his head, unable to answer. The truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know what the school was thinking, or why they had made this decision. He didn't know if they had even considered how it might feel for him, for the other kids who had been hurt by Mr. Anderson's actions. It felt like the system was more concerned with following procedure than actually righting a wrong. I don't know what to do anymore," Jordan confessed. "I thought when I showed the truth, when I made it public, it would make a difference. But now he's coming back. It's like nothing changed." Marcus paused, his expression growing serious. "Yeah, I feel that too. But you know what? Maybe it's time to do something about it. Maybe it's time to make sure they don't just sweep this under the rug. You know, Jordan, sometimes you've gotta fight for what's right, even if it's not easy. Jordan looked at Marcus, unsure what he meant. Fight for what's right. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's time to go public. Like, really public. Get people to know what he did. You know, get the word out. Make sure this doesn't just disappear. Jordan stared at him, the idea turning over in his mind. What are you talking about? Like, make a big scene. What if that makes things worse? Marcus shrugged. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. But you know what? It's not fair for you to just sit back and let this slide. You've already done what you can with the principal, but what if the community knew? What if parents, other students, teachers, they all knew what Mr. Anderson did? Jordan's stomach twisted at the thought. Was Marcus right? Could they really go further? Was it worth the risk? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his dad. Jordan, we need to talk when you get home. It's about Mr. Anderson. Please come home after school. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. What now? Had something changed? Was the investigation moving faster than he thought? I gotta go, Jordan said, standing up. I'll think about what you said, Marcus. His friend gave him a supportive nod, but Jordan could see the concern in his eyes. Take care of yourself, man. Whatever happens, you know I got your back. When Jordan got home, his dad was already waiting for him. The look on his face was more serious than usual, and Jordan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was it. This was the moment he'd been dreading. Jordan, his dad said quietly, gesturing for him to sit. I got a call today. From Principal Harris. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. He sat down, trying to calm himself. What did she say? His dad took a deep breath. They're considering bringing in outside support for this case. They're looking into the possibility of getting the media involved. They think that if this goes public, it might push things in the right direction. Jordan blinked, unsure if he'd heard his dad correctly. The media? Are you saying they want to make this public? His dad nodded slowly. Yes, but here's the thing, Jordan. It's a big decision. If you go public, there's no going back. It will put a lot of pressure on the school, on Mr. Anderson, but it will also put a lot of pressure on you. People will ask questions. They'll scrutinize everything. And you'll have to be prepared for that. Jordan sat back, his mind racing. I don't know if I'm ready for all that. What if it gets worse? What if people turn on me? What if they blame me for making this a bigger deal? I know you're scared, his dad said, his voice softening. But you've already taken a stand. You've already done something that not many people would have the courage to do. And you've got a chance to make a real difference here. But if you decide to go public, you have to be ready for what comes next. Jordan closed his eyes, thinking about everything that had happened so far. The fear. The frustration. The feeling of helplessness. But what had kept him going was the idea of justice. He had done the right thing. He had stood up when no one else would. And maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to push even harder for what was right. He thought about the kids who were too scared to speak up, the ones who might suffer the same way he had. He thought about Mr. Anderson, who had gotten away with so much for so long. Jordan clenched his fists. I'm going to do it, Jordan said, his voice steady but firm. I'm going public. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what he did. No one else should have to go through this. His dad smiled, pride in his eyes. I knew you had it in you, son. As the conversation ended, Jordan felt a new sense of determination rise within him. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. The battle was about to get bigger, but he was ready for it. Jordan could hardly sleep the night after his decision. His mind raced through every possible scenario, every possible consequence of going public. There was no turning back now. He had told his dad he was ready, but deep down, he wondered if he really was. What would it be like to see his story splashed across newspapers, trending on social media? What if it turned into a disaster? What if people misunderstood him or blamed him for bringing down the whole system? But the more he thought about it, the more his resolve hardened. He couldn't just sit back anymore. It wasn't just about him, it was about everyone else who had been silenced, the ones who felt powerless and alone. He had a chance to make a real difference, to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. The next morning, as soon as Jordan got to school, everything felt different. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire school knew something big was about to happen. And it was. He had just decided to take on a fight much bigger than he ever thought possible. His dad had reached out to some local reporters, and the school had received multiple calls requesting interviews. Jordan felt the weight of their eyes on him as he walked through the halls, but this time, it wasn't fear he felt, it was something else. Determination. A sense of purpose. Marcus was waiting for him by his locker. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter than usual. Jordan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he felt okay. "Yeah. I'm good. I'm ready to do this." Marcus gave him a grin that Jordan couldn't help but return. "You sure? This is gonna get crazy." "I know," Jordan said. "But I don't care anymore. It's time for people to hear the truth." As the day went on, the tension in the air only increased. The whispers were everywhere. Teachers seemed distracted, students murmured in hushed tones, and there were even a few reporters standing by the school entrance, taking notes and snapping pictures. The buzz was undeniable. News of Jordan's decision to go public had already spread beyond the school. Local media outlets were taking the story seriously. Jordan could hardly focus in class. Every time the bell rang and he moved from one room to the next, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some of them looked at him with admiration, others with uncertainty. It was hard to tell who was on his side and who was just waiting to see how this would all unfold. At lunch, Jordan sat down at his usual table, but it wasn't as quiet as before. Everyone was talking, discussing the news. "You think they'll really fire Mr. Anderson?" one girl asked. "I don't know, but I heard they're interviewing the whole school." "I bet there's more kids than we know who've had problems with him," said another voice. Jordan could hear his name whispered several times across the room. His stomach turned, but he reminded himself, this was why he was doing it. He wanted the truth to come out. He wanted others to know they weren't alone. As the lunch period wound down, the principal made an announcement over the loudspeaker, confirming that the school was cooperating with the investigation in the media. She emphasized that the process was still ongoing and that anyone with information could come forward. Jordan didn't need to hear more to know that everything was about to change. Later that afternoon, Jordan was called to the principal's office. His heart skipped a beat as he walked down the hallway. When he entered, he found Principal Harris sitting behind her desk, along with another woman Jordan didn't recognize, an older woman in a suit. "Jordan," Principal Harris said, her tone professional but kind. "This is Mrs. Keller. She's with the district. We're here to talk about the next steps." Jordan stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment, his mind racing. "Next steps?" "Yes," Mrs. Keller said, standing up and extending her hand. "We're handling this investigation at the district level now. I just wanted to personally introduce myself and let you know that you're doing the right thing by speaking up. We know this isn't easy, but we appreciate your courage." Jordan didn't know how to respond. He shook her hand but felt a gnawing sense of doubt creeping in. He had done the right thing, but how much was it really going to change? "We're going to be doing a thorough investigation," Principal Harris added. "We've already interviewed several students and staff, and the media will likely want to get statements from you soon. Are you ready for that?" Jordan swallowed hard. "I guess so. I just want to make sure he doesn't come back. I want everyone to know what he did." Principal Harris gave him a sympathetic look. "We're doing everything we can. I know this is difficult, Jordan, but just remember, you're not alone in this. The truth is on your side." Jordan nodded, trying to steady himself. "I know. I just want things to change." After the meeting, Jordan returned to class, his mind swirling with everything he had just heard. The district was getting involved. Media outlets were circling. His name was out there, and so was Mr. Anderson's. There was no going back now. That evening, Jordan sat down with his dad. The news was everywhere now, articles in the local paper, online forums buzzing with people debating the case. Some supported Jordan's decision to go public, others called him troublemaker. The messages were flooding in, both positive and negative. "We did the right thing, right?" Jordan asked, his voice uncertain. His dad smiled reassuringly. "You did. No matter what anyone says, you told the truth. And the truth will always matter, no matter how hard it is." Jordan's eyes were glued to his phone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was changing in ways he didn't fully understand yet. This wasn't just about Mr. Anderson anymore. This was about him, his future, and the person he was becoming. The more people spoke about the case, the more Jordan realized that he was a part of something bigger than himself, a movement for justice, for transparency, for accountability. And it was only just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of media interviews, phone calls, and endless school whispers. Jordan had never imagined that speaking out would lead to so much attention. The press was everywhere. News vans lined the streets outside the school. Reporters stood at the gates, microphones in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jordan, or anyone who might speak on his behalf. At first, it felt like a dream, a surreal moment where Jordan was finally being heard. But the pressure began to weigh heavily on him. He had never wanted to be a public figure. He had never wanted to become the center of a media storm. All he had wanted was to stop Mr. Anderson from ever hurting another student. Now, his life had become the subject of conversation, a topic for discussion in living rooms across the city. Each morning, Jordan would wake up to a new notification on his phone. People were talking about him. Some supported him, others criticized him. It was the same at school. Some of his classmates gave him encouraging nods, while others made cruel comments behind his back. Every eye seemed to be on him, every whisper a reminder that his life was no longer just his own. On Monday, the local news station did a special segment on Jordan's story. They interviewed several students who had spoken out against Mr. Anderson, as well as experts on teacher conduct and bullying. The segment was powerful, with footage of Jordan walking into the school surrounded by cameras. By the time Jordan returned home that evening, his phone was buzzing non-stop. Messages from classmates, friends, strangers, it was overwhelming. But there was one message that caught his attention. It was from Marcus. "Yo, Jordan, check out this thread online. People are losing their minds. Some of these comments are crazy. You need to see this." Jordan opened the link, and his heart sank. The thread was a mix of support and outrage, but what hit him hardest were the hateful comments. People accusing him of trying to ruin someone's career. Blaming him for bringing attention to an incident that wasn't even a big deal. There were even some people who claimed he was lying, calling him a troublemaker, and worse. He scrolled through the comments, the words blurring together. It hurt. It hurt more than he expected. The media attention that had once felt like a victory now felt like a curse. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Jordan tossed his phone on the couch and sank into the chair. His father walked in and sat beside him. "Everything okay, son?" his dad asked, looking at him with concern. Jordan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the wall, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. The guilt. The pressure. The overwhelming need to do what was right, and yet feeling so small in the face of such a massive situation. "I don't know if I can do this," Jordan finally said, his voice quiet. His dad placed a hand on his shoulder. "What do you mean?" I thought standing up for myself, for what happened, would be enough," Jordan said. "But now, it feels like I'm just making everything worse. Like it's too much, and I can't handle it." His dad looked at him for a moment before replying. "Jordan, I won't lie. This isn't easy. You're in the middle of something big, and it's natural to feel overwhelmed. But remember why you started this. You wanted the truth to come out. You wanted to stop what happened to you from happening to anyone else." Jordan nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. But sometimes, I just wish I could go back to how things were before any of this. Before Mr. Anderson. Before the media. Before everything." His dad took a deep breath. "I understand. And I know it's tough. But you've already made a difference. You've spoken out, and others are starting to take notice. You're doing what so many people are too afraid to do. But it's going to be hard. It's going to feel lonely sometimes. And people will criticize you, even if they don't know the full story." Jordan closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. His dad's words felt like a comfort and a burden all at once. He had always wanted to do the right thing, but the reality of that was different from what he imagined. "I just don't want people to think I'm doing this for attention," Jordan murmured. "I don't want to be the center of the story. I want people to focus on what happened to me. To focus on Mr. Anderson and what he did." His dad nodded. "And that's exactly why you need to keep going. Because you're doing this for the right reasons. And eventually, people will see that. It won't be easy, but you're strong. You've always been strong." The conversation was quiet after that. Jordan's dad didn't try to force him to feel better or tell him everything would be fine. He simply let Jordan sit with his thoughts, offering comfort through his presence. The next day at school, the atmosphere was charged. The media was still there, and the tension was palpable. Mr. Anderson was due to return soon, and there was still no official statement from the district. The students were talking, but the air felt thick with uncertainty. Jordan walked through the halls, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. His stomach twisted as he noticed students whispering behind his back. Some of them looked at him with sympathy, but others seemed distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching, waiting for him to crack. He made his way to his first period class, where the teacher greeted him with a thin smile. "How are you holding up, Jordan?" she asked quietly. Jordan shrugged, not wanting to say too much. "I'm okay." But as he sat down, his mind raced. What was going to happen next? How long could he keep going like this? Later that day, during lunch, Marcus found Jordan sitting alone in the courtyard. He dropped down next to him. "Man, I know this is a lot," Marcus said, giving Jordan a serious look. "But you can't let this get to you. You're doing the right thing, and that's all that matters." Jordan smiled faintly. "Thanks, Marcus. It's just hard. Some of the stuff people are saying, it really gets to me." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "I get it. But you're not in this alone. You've got me, you've got your family, and you've got all the people who are supporting you. You've already made a huge impact. You're doing something no one else had the courage to do. And that's something to be proud of." Jordan felt a small sense of relief at his words. Maybe he wasn't alone in this after all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Have you ever faced this kind of pressure when doing the right thing? How did you handle it? Let me know your thoughts. The days seemed to stretch endlessly for Jordan. The constant media attention, the growing whispers in the hallways, and the pressure to keep his head above water were starting to take a toll. Every time he walked through the school gates, he felt like he was stepping into a war zone. Some students gave him nods of support, others avoided eye contact, and some whispered in his direction. It felt like everyone had an opinion, and no matter which side they were on, Jordan couldn't escape it. What made it worse was that Mr. Anderson was still on administrative leave, pending the district's investigation. Rumors swirled about whether he would return to school or if he would be fired. Jordan didn't want to be the one to decide that, but he couldn't stop wondering what would happen if Mr. Anderson came back. Would he just pick up where he left off? Would he seek revenge for the public humiliation? And then, one day, Jordan's worst fear came true. Mr. Anderson was back. The announcement came early that morning over the school's loudspeakers. The principal, her voice a little too calm for Jordan's liking, informed the students that Mr. Anderson had returned to school after being cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. He would resume his teaching duties, but his behavior would be closely monitored as the investigation continued. The announcement hit Jordan like a punch in the stomach. How could the school allow him to come back? How could they just let him return to the classroom like nothing had happened? Jordan felt his anger rise. He couldn't just let Mr. Anderson walk back into that classroom, into his life, like it was nothing. Not after everything that had happened, not after the months of suffering he had gone through. During first period, Jordan barely paid attention. His mind was consumed by thoughts of confrontation. He had to talk to Mr. Anderson. He had to let him know that Jordan wasn't going to back down, that this fight wasn't over. But how? How could he confront someone who had hurt him so much? As the bell rang for the end of class, Jordan gathered his things, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to speak up. He couldn't let fear keep him quiet anymore. He found himself standing outside the classroom door, staring at the wood paneling. His palms were sweaty, his mind racing with 100 different thoughts. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, Mr. Anderson stood at the front of the class, his back turned to the students. He was talking to a group of students seated near the front, and when Jordan stepped inside, the room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. It felt like everyone was watching. Mr. Anderson turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Jordan," he said, his voice cool but not unkind. "I didn't expect to see you in here today." Jordan felt his anger flare but forced himself to stay calm. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking slightly but steady. "You should be gone. You should have been fired." Mr. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I've been cleared. There's nothing more to it." Jordan felt a hot rush of emotion, but he refused to back down. "You hurt me," he said, his voice rising. "And you hurt other kids. You can't just act like everything's fine." There was a long silence. Mr. Anderson's face didn't betray any emotion, but Jordan saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that might have been anger or frustration. He took a step toward Jordan, but the students in the room shifted in their seats, looking between them, some whispering. "I've done nothing wrong," Mr. Anderson said firmly. "You're making things up. You're making this worse than it needs to be. This is all about attention, isn't it?" Jordan's blood boiled. "It's not about attention. It's about what you did to me. To others. And if you think you're just going to keep getting away with it, you're wrong." The tension in the room was unbearable. It felt like the walls were closing in on Jordan, but he stood his ground. He wouldn't let this man intimidate him anymore. Not now, not ever. Before Mr. Anderson could respond, the door swung open, and Principal Harris stepped inside. She looked between Jordan and Mr. Anderson, her face a mask of professionalism. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jordan didn't want to back down, but he didn't want to make a scene in front of the whole class either. He turned toward her, his chest heaving with frustration. He shouldn't be here. Not after everything. Mr. Anderson shot Jordan a look, one that sent a shiver down his spine, before he spoke up. I have every right to be here. I've been cleared. I don't need to justify myself to anyone. Principal Harris's eyes shifted between the two of them. I think this conversation is best left for another time, Jordan, she said softly, though there was an edge to her voice. Mr. Anderson, if you could step outside for a moment. Mr. Anderson didn't argue. He straightened up and walked out of the classroom, leaving Jordan and Principal Harris standing in the silent room. Jordan's heart was still racing, and his mind was still filled with anger. But Principal Harris didn't say anything immediately. She just looked at him, waiting for him to calm down. You've made your point, she finally said. But remember, we're in the middle of an investigation. And it's not just about what you've been through. It's about making sure everyone involved is treated fairly. You need to trust the process, Jordan. Jordan wanted to argue. He wanted to scream that he couldn't trust the process because the system had already failed him once. But he didn't. He just nodded, his emotions too tangled to express clearly. I'll talk to you later, Principal Harris said, placing a hand on his shoulder as she left the room. Jordan stood there for a moment, his mind spinning. He had confronted Mr. Anderson. It wasn't the grand, definitive moment he had imagined. But it was a start. The days after the confrontation with Mr. Anderson were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Jordan had hoped that standing up for himself would feel empowering, but instead, it left him feeling more exhausted than ever. The weight of it all, the attention, the pressure, and the constant fear of what might happen next, was starting to take its toll. He no longer knew what was worse, being ignored, or being in the spotlight all the time. The next day at school, the atmosphere had shifted. The students seemed more divided than ever. Some, like Marcus, offered support. But others, especially those who had been in Mr. Anderson's class for years, began to show their disapproval. They whispered behind Jordan's back, judging him for what they called ruining the teacher's career. The whispers stung, but Jordan had grown used to them by now. What hurt more, however, was the silence from his own family. Ever since his father had spoken to the media, things had been different. His dad was often distracted, buried in phone calls and meetings with the lawyer. His mom, though supportive, was struggling to navigate the constant scrutiny. Jordan couldn't help but feel like he was drifting further and further away from everyone around him. At lunch, Marcus found him in the courtyard, sitting alone under a tree, staring out at the empty field. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken words. You doing okay? Marcus asked, sitting down next to him. You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders. Jordan shrugged, but it was a hollow gesture. He didn't have the energy to pretend everything was fine. I don't know, man. This is harder than I thought. People are saying stuff. They think I'm making it all up. And I feel like I'm just sinking. Marcus sighed. Yeah, I've heard some of the stuff. People can be jerks. But you gotta know that they don't get it. They don't know what you've been through. What Mr. Anderson did to you isn't something people can just forget. Don't let them make you feel small. Jordan didn't respond immediately. He was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of explaining himself, tired of feeling like he was constantly on trial. All he wanted was to go back to a life where things were simple. Where school was just about learning, not surviving. I know, but it's hard, Marcus, he said finally. I'm doing the right thing, but I can't make people see that. They think I'm just trying to get attention, or that I'm being dramatic. And I feel like I'm just drowning in it. Marcus shook his head. You're not drowning. You're speaking out. There's a difference. A lot of people are scared to say anything. But you've got the guts to stand up, even when it feels like no one's listening. I don't feel like anyone's listening anymore, Jordan said quietly, looking down at his half-eaten lunch. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder, a rare moment of seriousness. You're listening, though. You're speaking for people who can't. And even when it feels like you're all alone, you're not. You've got people who've got your back. Including me. Jordan managed a weak smile. He appreciated Marcus's support, but even his best friend's words didn't feel like enough. The fight felt too big. It wasn't just about Mr. Anderson anymore. It was about the entire system that had failed him, his school, his community, and the people who were supposed to protect him. The following day, the school board's investigation into Mr. Anderson's actions was the talk of the day. There were rumors that the board would make an announcement soon, but no one knew when or what the outcome would be. Jordan tried not to focus on it too much, but it was impossible to ignore. The entire school seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the decision that would determine what happened next. As the final bell of the day rang, Jordan grabbed his bag and headed out the door. He was eager to leave school behind for the day, even though he knew he wouldn't escape the thoughts swirling in his mind. When he arrived home, his dad was sitting at the kitchen table, papers scattered in front of him. The lawyer's office had been calling non-stop, and it was clear that the pressure was getting to his father as well. He hadn't been home much, and Jordan could sense the growing tension between them. "Hey, kid," his dad said, looking up from the papers. "How was school?" Jordan shrugged, not wanting to get into it. "Same as usual. A lot of people are saying stuff about me. Some good, some bad." His dad frowned. "Ignore it, son. People don't know the whole story. They don't know what happened to you. Just focus on what's important. What's right." "I'm trying," Jordan said quietly, sitting down across from his dad. "But it feels like no one's really listening. It's just noise everywhere." His dad sighed, rubbing his face. "I get it. This isn't easy for you. It isn't easy for any of us. But you're doing the right thing. And eventually, people will see that. This will be over, and it'll get better. You just have to hang on." Jordan didn't respond right away. He wanted to believe his dad, but the weight of the situation was overwhelming. How long could he keep fighting before everything came crashing down? That evening, as he sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, he came across something that made his heart race, a post from the local news channel. The headline read, "School Board Decision on Mr. Anderson's Future to be Announced Tomorrow Morning." Jordan's stomach churned. The decision was imminent. And with it came the realization that whatever happened next could change everything. He had no control over the outcome, and it scared him more than anything. The morning arrived with an air of tension so thick that it felt suffocating. Jordan's phone buzzed incessantly, with messages from Marcus and others asking if he'd heard the latest news. The school board was about to make their decision regarding Mr. Anderson's future, and the entire school seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. Jordan couldn't focus. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was about to be swept into a storm that he had no control over. He stood by the window, staring out at the horizon, his mind racing. What would the board decide? Would Mr. Anderson be allowed to return to the classroom, despite everything? Or would they finally see the truth and remove him for good? No matter what happened, Jordan knew one thing for certain: this decision would define him. It would either validate everything he had fought for or crush him under the weight of defeat. As the clock ticked down, Jordan finally picked up his phone and texted Marcus, "You ready for this?" Marcus replied quickly, "Ready as I'll ever be." "I'm with you, bro." Jordan felt a tiny flicker of reassurance from his friend's words, but it didn't last long. He was standing on the edge of something huge, and no matter how hard he tried to brace himself, he couldn't stop the anxiety that gripped him. By the time the final bell rang, the decision had been made. The entire school gathered in the gymnasium for a special assembly. There were murmurs in the air, whispers shared between students, teachers, and staff. Everyone was waiting to find out what had happened behind the closed doors of the school board meeting. As Jordan walked through the halls, his stomach churned with nerves. He passed by a few students who gave him furtive glances, some with disdain, others with curiosity. But no one spoke to him. It felt as though the entire world had frozen in place, all eyes on him as he made his way to the gym. When he entered, the gymnasium was buzzing with anticipation. The principal, Mrs. Harris, stood at the podium with a stern expression on her face. The chairs in the bleachers were filled with students and staff, all waiting for the announcement that would decide the next chapter of their school's history. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Harris began, her voice clear but tense. "As you all know, we've been going through an investigation regarding Mr. Anderson's conduct, and today we have an important update. I ask that you all remain calm and respectful as we move forward." Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for, and dreading. Mrs. Harris paused for a moment, looking down at the papers in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was somber. "After careful consideration and review of all the evidence, the school board has made a decision regarding Mr. Anderson's future at our school. Effective immediately, Mr. Anderson will no longer be employed as a teacher here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Jordan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The decision was final. Mr. Anderson was gone. But even as relief flooded him, a part of Jordan felt hollow. He had fought for this moment, but now that it had arrived, the victory didn't feel as sweet as he had imagined. The road ahead was still uncertain. The fallout from Mr. Anderson's removal wasn't going to be easy to navigate. There were still students who would be angry with him. There were still people who would question his motives. And the battle for justice wasn't over, it was just beginning. That afternoon, Jordan found himself back at his usual spot under the tree in the courtyard, his mind racing. He hadn't talked to Marcus yet about the announcement, but he needed time to process everything. The weight of the decision settled on him heavily. Mr. Anderson was gone, but what did that really mean for him? For his future? For the school? For the people who still didn't believe him? "Hey," a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Jordan looked up to see his dad standing in front of him. He hadn't seen his father much the past few weeks. Between the constant legal meetings and trying to protect Jordan, his dad had been distant, lost in a world of adult problems that Jordan didn't fully understand. But now, standing in front of him, his father had a look of pride in his eyes. "Hey, Dad," Jordan said, his voice flat. "What's up?" His dad sat down next to him, looking out at the school's wide-open field. "I wanted to talk to you about the decision," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I think you did the right thing, Jordan. I know it wasn't easy, and I know it hurt. But you stood up for what's right, and that takes guts." Jordan sighed, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "Yeah, but now what? It's done, but I feel like there's still so much more to deal with." His dad nodded thoughtfully. "There's always more to deal with. But that's life, right? You don't stop fighting just because one battle is won. You keep going. And I'm proud of you for how you've handled all of this. No matter what happens next, you've already proven something huge." Jordan wasn't sure what to say to that. Part of him wanted to feel proud, wanted to feel like this was the end of a journey. But the reality was that it felt like just another beginning. The fight for justice, for his own peace of mind, wasn't over. "Well, I guess I'll keep going," Jordan said, finally feeling a spark of determination. "I won this round, but I don't know what comes next. But I'll figure it out." His dad smiled and patted him on the back. "That's my boy. Whatever comes next, I know you'll be ready." As the school day ended and Jordan walked out the gates, he couldn't help but feel like he was at the start of something new. The decision had been made. Mr. Anderson was gone, and Jordan had won. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the next chapter in his life, a chapter where he would have to find a way to heal, to grow, and to keep moving forward. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jordan knew one thing: he wasn't alone. He had the support of his friends, his family, and, most importantly, his own voice. And no matter what came next, that was something no one could ever take away. The day after the school board's decision was filled with uncertainty. Though the weight of the announcement had finally lifted, the truth was that Jordan wasn't sure how to move forward. The feeling of relief he had hoped for hadn't fully materialized. Instead, there was a hollow echo left behind, like the silence after a storm. The people who had once stood by him seemed distant now, and the ones who had opposed him were quieter, but there was no sense of closure. Jordan had braced himself for the consequences of standing up to Mr. Anderson, but nothing could have prepared him for the ripple effect it caused. There were small, awkward glances in the hallways, hushed conversations in classrooms, and the constant feeling that he was being watched. Though some students admired his courage, others were outright hostile. His classmates, who once just saw him as another face in the crowd, now saw him as a symbol, an emblem of resistance, or perhaps, a troublemaker. As he sat at lunch the next day, his eyes scanned the cafeteria, looking for a familiar face. Marcus had been avoiding him. It wasn't that Marcus had abandoned him, far from it, but there was a tension between them now. Maybe it was the weight of what had happened, or maybe it was because Marcus was unsure of where to stand in all of this. Jordan finally spotted him sitting at a table with a few other friends. They were talking quietly, but when they noticed Jordan looking over, the conversation faltered. Marcus shot him a quick look before nodding his head for Jordan to join them. "Hey, man," Jordan said as he approached the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He noticed the shift in the atmosphere immediately. It wasn't the same easy camaraderie they'd once shared. The weight of the situation hung in the air like an unspoken tension. "Hey," Marcus replied, his voice quiet. "How you holding up?" Jordan shrugged. "I'm getting by. I guess. You know how it is." One of the other guys at the table, a kid named Daniel who had been one of the loudest voices against Jordan's actions, spoke up. "So, Mr. Anderson's gone, huh? That's pretty crazy." Jordan nodded, keeping his gaze on the table in front of him. "Yeah, he's gone. It's over." But it wasn't really over. Jordan knew that. "So, what now?" Daniel continued, looking at him with something between curiosity and mockery. "Is that it? No more drama? No more justice?" Jordan's pulse quickened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Come on, man," Daniel said with a slight chuckle. "You really think this is the end of it? People still talk about you behind your back. Everyone's got an opinion. And now, all of a sudden, you're the hero." His tone was dismissive, but his words stung. Marcus shot Daniel a glare. "Cut it out, man." Jordan did what he had to do. But Jordan didn't feel like a hero. In fact, he wasn't sure what he felt at all. This wasn't about being a hero or being right. It was about surviving. It was about navigating the broken system that had left him with no other choice but to stand up. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Jordan admitted quietly, looking up at Marcus. "I thought this would be over once they fired him, but it's not. People still talk about it. They still look at me like I'm the one who caused all this." Marcus softened. "It'll blow over, man. It's just, all fresh right now. People need time to process it. But they'll see you were right." Jordan didn't respond. He didn't feel like he was right, he just felt exhausted. His eyes were heavy with the weight of everything. Even with Mr. Anderson gone, the battle wasn't finished. It felt like the aftermath had just begun, and it was hard to see what the next step even looked like. Later that afternoon, Jordan walked home, the long way around the block to avoid the school parking lot. The familiar sights of his neighborhood were comforting, but they didn't ease the pressure he felt in his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. What had once been a place of solace now felt like a prison, each house on the block a reminder of everything that had changed since his fight against Mr. Anderson had begun. When he got home, his mom was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of spaghetti sauce filled the house, a stark contrast to the heaviness he felt. She smiled when she saw him, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Jordan knew that she had been struggling too. The constant phone calls, the looks from the neighbors, it was wearing on her as much as it was on him. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly. "How was school today?" Jordan shrugged, dropping his backpack on the couch. "Same as usual. People are still talking. Some good, some bad." His mom sighed, setting the spoon down. "It'll calm down eventually. You've done the right thing, Jordan. I'm proud of you." He gave her a tight smile but didn't say anything. He didn't feel proud. He felt trapped. He didn't know what to say or how to feel. The whole situation had left him raw, exposed, and he didn't know where to go from here. After dinner, his dad came home. As usual, he was preoccupied, walking straight to the kitchen with a briefcase in hand. He seemed different lately, more distant, more consumed by everything happening around them. Jordan watched him for a moment before speaking. "Dad, do you think I did the right thing?" His father paused, looking up from his work. His face softened when he saw the concern in his son's eyes. "Of course you did. You stood up for what was right. And you're stronger because of it. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jordan nodded, though his doubts remained. He wanted to believe his dad, but the feeling of doubt gnawed at him. Nothing felt certain. Not anymore. The next day, as Jordan walked to school, he noticed the familiar crowd of students outside the entrance, talking in hushed voices. He was used to the whispers by now, but it felt different today. He couldn't put his finger on why. When he walked into the school, he was greeted by more stares, but this time, there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. A few students, some he didn't even know, gave him brief nods of acknowledgement. Not smiles, but nods. And that was something. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was a recognition that, despite everything, Jordan had made a mark. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The weeks following Mr. Anderson's dismissal were a blur for Jordan. The tension that once clouded the hallways of the school seemed to have dissipated, but in its place, there was something far more insidious, an uncomfortable quiet. It wasn't that people had forgotten about the events that had unfolded, it was that everyone was waiting. Waiting for Jordan to make a mistake, waiting for the next chapter to begin, but most of all, waiting for a sign that things could return to normal. For Jordan, though, normal was a thing of the past. His thoughts were never too far from what had happened with Mr. Anderson, and he found himself wrestling with the feelings that lingered after the storm had passed. There were moments when he felt relieved that it was over, but there were just as many moments where he felt lost, as though the world had shifted beneath him and he wasn't sure which direction to go in anymore. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jordan found himself back at his usual spot under the tree in the school courtyard. He needed time to think, to process everything that had transpired, but mostly, he needed time to just breathe. The weight of the past few weeks had been suffocating, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to sit still. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "You free after school? We need to talk about something." Jordan quickly replied, "Yeah, sure. What's up?" The reply came almost instantly, "Just meet me at the park. I'll explain there." Jordan wasn't sure what Marcus needed to talk about, but he didn't think it would be anything simple. After everything that had happened, their relationship had become a bit strained. While Marcus had been there for him throughout the ordeal, things had changed. The dynamic between them had shifted, and Jordan couldn't tell if it was because of the events at school or something deeper that was going unsaid. The park was only a short walk from the school, and by the time Jordan arrived, Marcus was already waiting on the bench, a serious look on his face. As soon as Jordan sat down, Marcus didn't waste any time. "Man, I've been thinking about everything," Marcus began, looking down at the ground. "About what happened with Anderson, about what you've been going through, and," he paused, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I'm not sure if I made the right choice, Jordan." Jordan frowned, unsure where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" Marcus met his gaze. "I mean, I know I stood by you, but lately, I've been wondering if I should have just stayed out of it. There's a lot of people at school, including my own friends, who think you went too far. Maybe it wasn't worth all the trouble." Jordan's chest tightened at Marcus's words. "So you're saying I was wrong?" "No, that's not what I'm saying," Marcus replied quickly, shaking his head. I don't know, man. Things have been so weird since. It's like we're both stuck in this situation that we can't get out of. And I don't know how to fix it." Jordan ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "I didn't do this for fun, Marcus. You saw the way Anderson treated me, the way he treated other kids. I couldn't just let it go. And you were right there with me. So what's changed?" "It's not about what's changed," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "It's about how we're both dealing with it. I don't know if we're handling it the way we should. I feel like I'm caught between supporting you and trying to just move on, and honestly, I don't know what moving on looks like anymore." Jordan stared at him, feeling a pang of guilt for putting Marcus in this position, but he also felt hurt. "So now you're saying you regret having my back?" "No." Marcus's response was immediate, but his tone softened. "It's not that. I think we need to figure out how to live with what happened. We can't undo it, but we need to stop pretending like everything's fine when it's not. I'm not sure where we go from here." Jordan looked away, his thoughts swirling. It was hard to accept that things had changed between them. That the simple friendship they had once shared was now muddied by everything that had transpired. It was a harsh truth, one that left him feeling more alone than ever. "I don't know either, Marcus," Jordan admitted quietly. "I wish I did." The two of them sat in silence for a while, neither of them knowing what to say next. The sound of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze seemed so distant, almost foreign in the quiet tension between them. Later that night, Jordan sat alone in his room, staring at the wall. His phone lay face up on the desk, but there were no messages. No updates. No signs of anything changing. He had won the fight for justice, but now he was left with a deeper, more personal battle: how to heal the parts of himself that had been broken by all of this. His thoughts drifted to his mom and dad. They had tried to reassure him, to tell him that he'd done the right thing, but he wasn't sure they understood the depth of the impact it had had on him. The victory was bittersweet, and every time he thought he might feel relief, another layer of doubt crept in. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor of something far bigger than he had ever expected. The next morning, as he walked into school, Jordan could feel the eyes on him once again. It was like he was under a microscope, every move scrutinized. He had hoped that things would start to feel normal, but instead, he felt like a ghost, someone everyone watched but no one truly saw. The whispers followed him as he made his way through the halls, but today, there was something different. Something was beginning to shift in the air. The tension that had been so sharp before was softening. It wasn't the complete acceptance he had wanted, but it was a start. People were starting to acknowledge him, not with judgment, but with understanding. By the time the bell rang to signal the end of the day, Jordan was drained. As he walked toward the parking lot, he noticed Marcus waiting by the gate, a hopeful expression on his face. Jordan walked over slowly, his heart still heavy, but something about Marcus's presence made him feel less alone. "You doing okay?" Marcus asked, his voice careful. I'm getting there, Jordan said, offering a small smile. I don't know where we go from here, but I guess we'll figure it out. Marcus grinned, clapping him on the back. Yeah, man. One step at a time. Jordan's smile widened slightly. Maybe that was all he needed, one step at a time. And for the first time in a while, he felt like he might just be able to take that first step toward moving on. The days seemed to blur into one another for Jordan. After the conversation with Marcus, he tried his best to focus on the small victories in his life, his mom's smile when he helped her cook dinner, the occasional nod from a student at school, and the fleeting moments when the weight of his actions didn't feel so suffocating. But each day felt like a balancing act, trying to stay steady under the pressure, while also feeling the constant pull of uncertainty. He found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror more often, questioning the person he had become in the past month. The version of himself that had walked into that classroom, eager to fit in and simply survive, felt so far removed from who he was now. He had been forced to grow up fast, to stand up for something he believed in, but in doing so, it had come with consequences that he wasn't fully prepared for. The following week, the school board had a meeting to address the aftermath of Mr. Anderson's firing. Jordan wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe an official apology to the students, or a public acknowledgement of the issues that had been swept under the rug for so long. But the meeting was different. It was sterile. It was as if everyone was more concerned with maintaining order than with addressing the real issues that had caused all of this to happen. Jordan sat quietly in the back of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the school board members as they spoke. They discussed new protocols, new training for teachers, and how the school was going to move forward. But there was no mention of the students, of the ones who had experienced the mistreatment firsthand. There was no real focus on the people who had fought to expose the truth. It felt like they were trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. Jordan's fingers drummed on the back of the chair in front of him, a mix of frustration and disappointment brewing inside him. It was clear to him now that no one was going to take real accountability for what had happened. No one was going to address the deep-seated issues of racism or the unequal treatment that had been so prevalent at the school for years. It was as if the problem had been resolved with the firing of one teacher, when in fact, the problem went much deeper. As the meeting went on, Jordan started to feel a growing sense of anger. Anger that the system was only concerned with appearances, with moving on, with pretending that everything was fine now that the obvious problem was dealt with. But he knew the truth, that the underlying issues would continue to fester unless they were acknowledged, addressed, and fought against. After the meeting ended, Jordan walked out of the room with a heavy heart. He could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. He had started this fight because he had to, because it was the right thing to do. But now that the battle had been won, what came next? What was the next step in this long journey toward change? Later that afternoon, Jordan sat alone in the park again, his thoughts racing. He had reached a point where he knew he couldn't just walk away. The fight for justice wasn't over, and the victory of getting rid of Mr. Anderson was only one small part of the larger picture. But what did he need to do next? He stared at the ground, his mind wandering, when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Marcus standing in front of him, looking hesitant. "Hey, man," Marcus said softly. "Can we talk?" Jordan nodded, pushing himself off the bench. "Yeah, I've been thinking a lot. About everything." Marcus sat down beside him. "So have I. I don't know if I'm doing this right, Jordan. I've been struggling to figure out where I fit into all of this. I didn't expect it to be like this." Jordan let out a long sigh. "I know what you mean. It's been a lot. And I thought after Anderson was gone, everything would go back to normal. But it hasn't. It feels like there's still so much left to fix, and I don't know where to start." Marcus looked at him, his eyes filled with understanding. "We can't just fix it overnight. But we can keep pushing, right? We've already made a difference." We've opened some eyes. But there's more to do. Jordan met his gaze. I don't know if I can do this alone, Marcus. I can't do this alone. You don't have to, Marcus replied. You never have. We've got each other. For the first time in a while, Jordan felt a small spark of hope flicker in his chest. He had been carrying this weight for so long, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. A way where he wasn't alone in this fight. That evening, Jordan's parents noticed a change in him. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but there was something different about him. His posture was straighter, his expression less burdened. Even his conversations had a sense of determination in them. His mom smiled at him from across the dinner table. You seem different tonight, Jordan. What's going on? He looked up from his plate and met her gaze. I think I figured it out, Mom. This is just the beginning. I know now that I can't just let things go back to the way they were. I have to keep fighting for what's right. But I don't have to do it alone. His dad raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. What do you mean by that? I've got Marcus, Jordan said with a slight smile. And maybe some other people too. There's more to be done. And this time, we're going to do it the right way. Jordan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a clear purpose again. It wasn't just about righting one wrong anymore, it was about creating real change. Change that went beyond the surface and reached deep into the heart of the school, of the community, and maybe even the world. The next day, Jordan returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly how things were going to play out, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let his fight for justice be an isolated moment in time. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. He and Marcus met up between classes, and for the first time, they talked about their plans. They talked about organizing, about speaking up when things weren't right, about standing up for the voiceless. The conversations were long, filled with ideas and possibilities, and for the first time in a while, Jordan felt the sense of unity he had been craving. The days that followed felt like an endless whirlwind. The new sense of purpose Jordan had found after his conversation with Marcus gave him a kind of strength he hadn't known he needed. However, the challenges ahead weren't as simple as standing up to Mr. Anderson. The systems, the people, and the culture that had allowed the injustices to happen were not going to change overnight. They were giants that Jordan wasn't sure he could face on his own. It was Friday morning when Jordan was called into the principal's office. His stomach twisted into knots as he walked through the familiar hallways, wondering what new development had unfolded. Was this about the protests that had happened in the wake of Mr. Anderson's firing? Or perhaps it was about the increasing whispers among students, rumors that had started to spread like wildfire. When he opened the door to the principal's office, he saw Principal Carter sitting behind her desk, her usual stern demeanor softened, but still carrying an air of authority. Sitting across from her was a woman Jordan didn't recognize, a tall, sharp-dressed woman in her late 40s, with piercing eyes and an expression that conveyed she wasn't here for small talk. Jordan, please sit down, Principal Carter said, gesturing to the chair beside her. He sat down cautiously, glancing between the principal and the stranger. I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Peterson, Principal Carter said. She's an investigator with the district. We've asked her to come in to talk to you about your experiences with Mr. Anderson and any additional concerns you might have about your safety or your well-being at school. Jordan's eyes widened. An investigator? Why do you need me to talk to her? Everything that happened with Mr. Anderson is over now. Ms. Peterson leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him with an almost unsettling intensity. We want to ensure that no stone is left unturned, Jordan. You were a key part of exposing what happened, and we want to make sure the school is a safe place for everyone moving forward. There may be more to uncover, and your input is crucial. Jordan felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't anticipated this, didn't know how to respond to this new level of scrutiny. His fight for justice had been personal, but now it felt like he was being pulled into something bigger, something far more institutional. What had once been a simple battle to stand up for himself and his peers was now turning into a much larger issue, one that involved more people and more layers of bureaucracy than he was prepared for. Principal Carter spoke again, this time with a gentle tone. "Jordan, we're not here to accuse you of anything. We just want to get your perspective, your experiences, as we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. What did they want to hear? What would they do with the information he gave them? Jordan was no longer sure if he could trust the system he had fought to change. The school had seemed so disconnected from its students for so long. Could they really fix what was broken, or was this just another form of damage control? "All right," Jordan said, his voice steady but guarded. "I'll tell you everything." The conversation with Ms. Peterson stretched on for an hour. She asked questions about the way Mr. Anderson had treated him, about any specific incidents that stood out in his mind. She asked about the other students who had been affected, about the whispers in the hallways, and even about the environment in the classroom. Jordan found himself reliving moments he had tried to suppress, those first awkward days in Mr. Anderson's class, the subtle but constant jabs, the way Anderson would mock him in front of others, the feeling of being constantly belittled. It was difficult to talk about, but it felt good to finally get it out in the open. For the first time, Jordan didn't feel like he was alone in his experience. Someone was listening. After the session, Principal Carter stood up and shook his hand. "Thank you for your honesty, Jordan. You've given us a lot to think about. We'll be in touch soon, and you'll hear from us regarding any next steps." As Jordan left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of something much larger than himself. He had started this journey fighting for himself and his friends, but now, it seemed like the fight was bigger than just one teacher, bigger than just one school. He didn't know where it would lead, but he was starting to understand that real change often meant going up against powerful institutions. It meant facing giants. That evening, Jordan found himself sitting at the kitchen table, stirring his dinner absent-mindedly. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Ms. Peterson, the weight of it pressing down on him. What would happen next? Would the school district really do anything meaningful with the information he had given them, or was this all just a formality to appease the public? His dad, noticing his silence, spoke up. "What's on your mind, son?" Jordan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "They asked me a lot of questions today, about everything that happened with Mr. Anderson. About how it made me feel, about what I went through. They want to make sure the school is a safer place for everyone, but I don't know if I trust them." His dad gave him a knowing look, setting down his glass. "I can understand that. You've been through a lot, and it's not easy to suddenly trust a system that's failed you. But remember, change doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes, it's about taking the first step and pushing for more." Jordan nodded, thinking about his dad's words. It was easy to feel disillusioned, to give up on the fight. But he couldn't do that. Not now. Not when he had come so far. The next morning, Jordan walked into school with a sense of resolve. He had a meeting with Marcus later that day to discuss how they could continue to push for change at the school. He couldn't be passive anymore. He couldn't just wait for someone else to fix the problem. If he wanted things to change, he would have to be the one to make it happen. As he walked past the classrooms, he noticed that people were talking about the school's investigation. Some of them were hopeful, believing that real change was on the horizon. Others were skeptical, thinking that it was just another PR stunt. Jordan knew better than to expect immediate results, but he couldn't let that stop him. Change was a long road, and he had already taken the first step. He found Marcus by their usual spot under the tree at lunch. Marcus was already waiting for him, a concerned look on his face. "So, how'd it go?" he asked. Jordan took a seat next to him, his eyes determined. "It's not over, Marcus. But I'm not giving up. We can't let this be another round of empty promises. We need to keep pushing, no matter what. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. I'm with you, man. We'll do this together. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Jordan stood up, ready to face whatever came next. He knew there would be obstacles ahead, and there would be moments when he felt like giving up. But with Marcus by his side, and with the support of his family, he was starting to understand what it really meant to fight for change. It wasn't just about standing up for yourself, it was about standing up for everyone who didn't have a voice. And for the first time, Jordan felt like he was ready to face whatever giants lay ahead. The week following the meeting with the investigator felt like a blur for Jordan. Each day brought new whispers in the hallways and new rumors circulating about the ongoing investigation into Mr. Anderson's actions. But what troubled Jordan the most was that the noise was starting to drown out the real issues, the systemic problems of inequality and the deeper biases embedded in the fabric of the school system. It was Wednesday afternoon when Jordan received an unexpected phone call. He was sitting in the cafeteria, eating his lunch, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing an unfamiliar number flash across the screen. Hesitant at first, he answered it anyway. "Hello?" he said, his voice wary. "Is this Jordan?" The voice on the other end was calm, but the urgency behind it was unmistakable. "This is Ms. Peterson from the school district. I need to speak with you about something important." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. "Ms. Peterson?" He sat up straighter, moving to a quieter corner of the cafeteria. "What's going on? Is everything okay? I need you to come into the district office immediately. There's something we need to discuss with you regarding your involvement in the investigation. It's important, and I can't discuss it over the phone." Jordan's stomach twisted into a knot. "Is this about Mr. Anderson? Did they find something else?" Ms. Peterson's voice softened, but there was still an edge to it. "I can't say much right now. But yes, it's related. I need you to come in. Can you be here in the next hour?" Jordan looked around the cafeteria, as if seeking answers from the students around him. He knew what he had to do. This was bigger than just another meeting about the investigation. Something wasn't right. Something was being hidden. "Okay, I'll be there," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. When Jordan arrived at the district office, he was greeted by Ms. Peterson in the sterile, white-walled conference room. There was a heaviness in the air that Jordan couldn't ignore. Ms. Peterson's usually calm demeanor seemed more guarded today, her eyes flicking nervously to the door as though expecting someone else to arrive at any moment. "Thank you for coming in," she said, gesturing for Jordan to sit down. "I'm going to be blunt with you. There's something you need to know about the investigation, and it's not something I can easily explain." Jordan furrowed his brow. "What do you mean? What's going on?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "We've uncovered some discrepancies in the school's records, things that point to a much larger issue than Mr. Anderson alone. Your testimony, along with the others who spoke up, has led us to uncover some serious misconduct within the school's administration and the way it handles discrimination cases. There are people in the system who have been working to protect the status quo." Jordan's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was uglier than he had imagined. "What do you mean? Who's involved?" he asked, his voice rising. Ms. Peterson looked at him carefully before answering. "There are individuals within the administration who have been deliberately suppressing complaints and investigations into discriminatory behavior. This wasn't just about Mr. Anderson. It's a systemic issue that has been ignored for years. And, Jordan, there's a reason this has all felt like one battle after another. The people in power are doing everything they can to keep this under wraps." Jordan was stunned into silence. He had suspected for a while that the problems went deeper than just one teacher, but to hear it so plainly, to know that the very system that was supposed to protect students was complicit in enabling this behavior, it shook him to his core. "Who's protecting them?" Jordan managed to say, his voice trembling with disbelief. I can't say too much, but there are people in the district who've been involved in burying these complaints. We have enough evidence now to start addressing it, but it's going to be a battle. And you, Jordan, you're at the center of it. You need to decide if you're ready to take this to the next level. It's not just about the school anymore. It's about exposing a culture of corruption that's been allowed to fester for far too long. The gravity of her words sank into Jordan's bones. He thought about his classmates, his friends, the people who had trusted him with their stories. He thought about his family, his mother, who had always told him to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I'm ready. I can't let them keep getting away with this. But, what happens now? What do I need to do? Ms. Peterson gave him a measured look. We need you to testify. We need you to speak up about what you've seen and heard. But this won't be easy. The people we're dealing with are powerful, and they won't go down without a fight. You'll need to be prepared for backlash, for threats. But if you're willing to move forward, we'll be with you every step of the way. Jordan sat back in his chair, absorbing the weight of what he had just agreed to. It was no longer just about one person. It was no longer just about the school. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined, and it was going to require more courage and resolve than he knew he had. I'll do it, he said finally. I'll speak up. I won't let them silence me or anyone else. Ms. Peterson nodded, her expression serious. I know you will. And we'll make sure you have the support you need. But you need to understand, this won't be quick. This is going to take time, and it's going to be hard. There will be days when you feel like giving up. But you can't. Not now. Jordan walked out of the district office later that afternoon, his head spinning with the information he had just learned. The weight of what he had agreed to was heavy, but the fire inside him only grew stronger. This wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore, it was about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had been pushed to the margins. He thought about the friends he had made along the way, Marcus, his family, his classmates. He knew they would be there for him, just like he would be there for them. Together, they were a force. That evening, as Jordan sat with his family at the dinner table, he knew that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The giants he faced were big, but he was ready to stand tall. And this time, he wasn't backing down. The days that followed Jordan's meeting with Ms. Peterson felt like a constant tug-of-war between hope and fear. The weight of the decision to testify, to step forward as a voice for change, pressed down on him with a sense of finality. He knew there was no turning back. The choice he had made would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who had been affected by the school's systemic failings. But as he prepared himself for the battle ahead, one thought kept echoing in his mind: what if no one believes me? What if the people who had spent years hiding behind their power structures would simply dismiss him, as they had done with others before him? The fear of being silenced again, of being ignored, gnawed at him every night as he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. It was Friday afternoon when Jordan finally received the call that would mark the beginning of the next chapter in this fight for justice. Jordan, it's Ms. Peterson, the voice on the other end of the line said. We're moving forward. We've got the date for your testimony. Jordan sat up straight, his pulse quickening. The moment was here, the moment he had both dreaded and anticipated for so long. When is it? He asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Next Thursday, Ms. Peterson replied. You'll need to be ready to speak in front of the school board. It won't be easy, but this is it. The first step in breaking the silence. Jordan's heart raced. He had been mentally preparing himself for weeks, but the reality of it hit him like a wave. This wasn't just about his school anymore. It was about the future of every student who had been made to feel invisible, overlooked, and ignored. I'll be ready, Jordan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I won't let them shut me down. The week leading up to the testimony passed in a blur of preparation, self-doubt, and moments of clarity. Jordan met with Ms. Peterson multiple times, running through what he would say, refining his words, and rehearsing in front of a mirror. Every time he practiced, his resolve grew stronger, but so did the nerves that accompanied it. He had never been in front of such a large audience, and the idea of speaking directly to the school board, the people who controlled his fate, terrified him. His friends were supportive, offering words of encouragement, but Jordan could tell they were just as nervous as he was. Marcus kept checking in with him, making sure he was staying grounded. "You've got this, man," Marcus said one afternoon after school. "You're doing the right thing. Just keep your head in the game, and don't let them shake you." Jordan nodded, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. But even with the people he trusted around him, the fear never fully left. It stayed in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Thursday morning came too quickly. The day of his testimony felt like a mix of dread and determination. Jordan got ready for school as usual, but there was no excitement in the air. His mom, who had always been his biggest supporter, gave him a tight hug before he left for the day. "Don't forget why you're doing this," she said, her eyes soft with pride. "It's not just for you, it's for everyone who's had to suffer in silence. You're making a difference, Jordan." The ride to school felt surreal. Jordan sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the weight of what was about to happen. As he pulled into the school parking lot, he saw other students gathering in front of the building, talking among themselves. Some of them looked worried, others hopeful. They had no idea that today, everything could change. The school board meeting was held in the auditorium, a space that felt more like a courtroom than a place for discussion. Jordan sat in the front row, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he waited for his turn. He could hear the murmur of voices behind him, a chorus of whispers and hushed conversations. He was aware of the eyes on him, the eyes of his classmates, the administrators, and the board members. The air was thick with anticipation. Ms. Peterson sat beside him, offering a reassuring smile, but even she seemed tense. "You're ready, Jordan. Just speak from the heart. They'll listen." Jordan swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. This wasn't just a speech. This was his truth, his story, and the story of everyone who had ever been silenced. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every student who had been overlooked, dismissed, or ignored. It was about justice. When the meeting finally reached his name, Jordan stood up, his legs trembling slightly beneath him. He took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room, standing before the microphone. The room fell silent. He could feel the eyes of the school board members on him, their faces unreadable. But there was one thing he knew for sure, he wasn't going to back down now. "My name is Jordan Williams," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "And I'm here to speak for myself, and for all the students who have been ignored, pushed aside, or made to feel like they don't matter. What happened with Mr. Anderson wasn't just about one teacher. It's about a system that allowed his behavior to continue for so long. It's about a school that failed to protect me, and failed to protect others." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The silence in the room was deafening, but he pressed on. "For years, I was treated differently because of who I am. My worth was measured by the color of my skin, not by my character. But I'm not the only one. There are students here who've been through the same thing, who've been made to feel invisible. I'm here because I believe we can do better. I believe we can be better. But that starts with listening to the voices that have been ignored for far too long." Jordan's words hung in the air, charged with emotion. He could see the board members' expressions change, some of them looking uneasy, others uncertain. But there was no turning back now. He had spoken his truth, and he wasn't going to let them dismiss it. He finished, his voice strong. "This isn't just about one teacher. It's about making sure that every student, no matter who they are, feels seen, heard, and valued. If we don't do that, then we're failing them. We're failing all of us. Jordan stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling in. But as he returned to his seat, he felt a surge of relief. He had done it. He had spoken his truth, and nothing could take that away from him. As the meeting continued, Jordan sat back in his seat, watching the reactions of the board members, the students, and the teachers around him. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, and the fight was far from over. But today, he had broken the silence. And for the first time in a long while, Jordan felt like his voice mattered. The aftermath of Jordan's testimony was a whirlwind. The day after his speech, his name seemed to be everywhere, on social media, in the local news, even in private conversations among the students and teachers at school. Everyone had something to say about it. Some praised him for his bravery, others criticized him for rocking the boat, but no one could ignore him. The school, and the district, were forced to reckon with the powerful truth he had spoken. But as the applause and praise rolled in, Jordan found himself feeling a strange sense of unease. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The spotlight might have been on him for now, but what about the bigger changes? What about the students who would come after him, the ones who would still face discrimination and inequity if things didn't truly change? That question lingered in Jordan's mind as he walked through the school halls the next week. Students greeted him with nods of approval, but he could see the mixed reactions on some of the teachers' faces. There were those who stood by him, but there were also others who seemed hesitant, unsure of where the line between support and self-preservation lay. When he arrived at his first class that morning, the door opened, and Principal Harris stepped inside. He wasn't a particularly tall man, but there was an air of authority that surrounded him, and for years, he had been a symbol of the status quo in Jordan's eyes. "Good morning, everyone," Principal Harris said, his voice steady but not without a trace of discomfort. "I know many of you have been following the events of the past week, and I want to assure you that we take the concerns raised seriously. We will be holding an additional meeting for faculty and staff later this week to address the issues, and we will be looking into how we can ensure that all students feel safe, respected, and heard." Jordan's gaze met Marcus's across the room. His friend offered him a small nod of reassurance, but Jordan knew that these words, while seemingly progressive, were just the beginning of a much longer road. The days following Jordan's testimony were filled with meetings, discussions, and negotiations. Ms. Peterson and other district officials worked tirelessly to address the corruption within the school system and the complacency that had allowed discriminatory practices to persist. There were rumors of disciplinary actions being taken against those involved in shielding Mr. Anderson and others like him, but Jordan knew that real change would require more than just punishment, it would require a deep, systemic overhaul. One Friday afternoon, as Jordan sat with his family at the kitchen table, his mother spoke up, her voice full of pride but also concern. "Jordan, I'm so proud of what you've done. You've shown so many people what it means to fight for what's right, but I want you to be careful. This isn't a battle that ends with just one speech, and there will be people who will try to silence you again. You've done something amazing, but I need you to remember to take care of yourself too." Jordan nodded, looking at his mother. He could see the worry in her eyes, but also a deep sense of pride. "I know, Mom. I won't back down. But I'm scared. What if it's not enough? What if things don't really change?" "You've already made a difference, Jordan," his mother said softly. "You've opened a door that was once locked. You've given people the courage to speak up, and that's something no one can take away from you." Jordan smiled, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She was right. Even if things didn't change overnight, he had done something important. He had started a conversation that had been long overdue, and now, others would follow. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the effects of Jordan's testimony began to be felt. The district announced a series of changes: new anti-discrimination policies, mandatory staff training on diversity and inclusion, and the formation of a student-led council to give students a direct voice in decision-making processes. It wasn't everything Jordan had hoped for, but it was a start. The work was far from finished, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like things were moving in the right direction. Jordan continued to speak out, advocating for those who still didn't have a voice. He joined the newly formed student council, working alongside others who were just as passionate about creating a more equitable environment for all students. Together, they pushed for stronger protections, more transparency, and accountability within the school system. As the year went on, Jordan noticed a shift, not just within the walls of the school, but in the larger community as well. Conversations about race, equality, and justice that had once been brushed aside were now at the forefront. Jordan saw his peers beginning to speak up about their own experiences, their own stories of discrimination and marginalization. For the first time, it felt like the silent voices were being heard. It was at the end of the school year when Jordan received the news that would confirm that his efforts had made a lasting impact. The school district had decided to honor him with a special award during the graduation ceremony, a recognition for his courage, his leadership, and his unwavering commitment to justice. As he stood on the stage that afternoon, accepting the award, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. A year ago, he had been a quiet student, uncertain about his place in the world. But now, he was standing in front of his peers, speaking not just for himself but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or unheard. Looking out at the audience, Jordan saw the faces of his friends, his family, and his classmates, people who had supported him every step of the way. He thought about Marcus, who had been by his side from the very beginning, and his mom, who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "I want to say thank you to everyone who supported me along this journey. This fight wasn't just about one teacher, and it wasn't just about one school. It's about all of us coming together and making sure that no one is ever silenced again. This is just the beginning. The road to change is long, but if we keep fighting together, I know we'll get there." The audience erupted in applause, and Jordan felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The fight was far from over, but as he stood there, surrounded by the people who had stood with him, he knew one thing for sure: change was possible, and it had already begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What changes would you like to see in your community? And what's the one thing you think needs to be done to ensure equality for all?